Well, when I start mixing, I actually don't even start at the console. I usually walk up to the stage first and start working with the musicians. Try to build a good relationship with them. A good relationship really goes a long way if you need changes or anything like that. After I talk to them, I usually check out tones, listen to the drums, see how the drums sound. If they sound dead, then you know you're going to have a hard time getting a good sound in the house. But if the drums sound great on stage, then you should probably be able to get them to sound great in the house without a whole lot of work. So that's always good to know. Try to listen to guitar tones, listen to the amp, see if it sounds good. If it sounds really thin, you might go ahead and mention it to the guitar player, kind of see how he feels about tweaking his tone a little bit. You can also go ahead and play with mic placement at that point too. If his tone is really thin, then you can go ahead and move the mic towards the outside of the cone a little bit and go ahead and compensate before you even hear it in the house. So after I do this, then I go ahead and walk out front. So when I sit down at the console, the first thing I do is kind of get familiar with everything if I'm not familiar with the console, make sure I know where everything is, that kind of thing. And then I make sure all my inputs are labeled, make sure if I'm working on an analog desk, make sure everything's zeroed. If I'm working on a digital desk, make sure I have a good starting place. If I'm using a template, go ahead and load that kind of thing, label everything. Another thing I like to do when I sit down at the console is check all my output masters, check my subgroups or VCAs if you have them. Make sure your main output is at unity. You just don't want any surprises later. You don't want to get almost done with your mix and then realize that your main output was at -30 and now your gain structure's all messed up. So no surprises there. You might actually check your aux masters too. Go ahead and make sure they're at unity as well. So after I've made sure everything's all in line and ready to go at front of house, the next thing I do is make sure I know what the end result is supposed to be, what style of music I'm mixing, that kind of thing. You need to know what sound you're going for before you start to build the sound. Most of the time for me, that style is just a general rock style, so pretty familiar with that. If I'm mixing a genre that I'm not really familiar with, definitely try and listen to it. You should really listen to the songs regardless so that you know what sound you're going for. Even if it's a style you're familiar with, you might not be familiar with the song. So try to get a recording of the song, listen to it, know the general vibe, what instruments should be prominent, which ones shouldn't be, where solos might be, that kind of thing. That always is a great thing to do. So I usually start with drums when I'm building a mix. I just start with kick drum. One important thing on that is to make sure you get your gain right, especially on a digital console. You really want to run your gain hot. You're usually going to get a much better sound out of the drum than if you have your gain really low. So be aware of that. So with the rock kick drum, I want to make sure I have a good balance of low frequencies and high frequencies for the attack. So some genres you might want a little less attack on the kick drum, and some genres you might want more attack on the kick drum, but in general, rock music is a pretty good balance between the two. Then I move on to snare. I want to make sure that the snare not only cuts through the mix, but has a lot of body. I don't really EQ my snare drum very bright. I usually go a little darker. You still need plenty of clarity there, but I like kind of the cannon sound, as I like to call it, where it's almost an explosion sound, not just a crack sound. So, and snare drum is something that changing the mic placement really makes a big difference in the sound. So if you're just struggling and you can't get a good sound, go move the mic. Point it more down into the drum or point it more across the drum. Just feel free to play around with that and until you get the sound that you want. I usually don't use a whole lot of hi-hat unless I need it, because I'll use my overheads for most of my cymbal sounds, including my hi-hat. So after I get the kick and snare up, I usually will go ahead and push the overheads up. That affects your overall sound of your kit a lot. It even affects your snare drum a lot, so you should kind of keep that in mind. I don't like the overheads to be too bright because that can be very painful. And at the same time, you don't want them too dark either because that just doesn't sound right. So usually go ahead and put a high pass on it to get rid of the nasty low frequencies that you don't want, and maybe take out some mid-range frequencies. After I have my kick and snare and overheads going for me, I'll usually move on to toms, and you might have to get your drummer to hit the toms for you so you can get a good sound check, because otherwise you'll be sitting there for 10 minutes waiting for him to hit the toms and waste a lot of time. With the toms, toms are very similar to the kick drum. You want to make sure you have enough low end presence there to make the drum sound big and warm, but you also want to make sure you have some high frequencies for your attack. And also miking the tom has a lot to do with its sound. So if you're having trouble getting a good sound, go play with your mic placement. And again, make sure the drum actually sounds decent on stage. If the drum sounds bad, then you're just not going to get a good sound. So once I have all the drums up and running, when I'm listening to a drum mix, there are a couple things I listen for. I want an overall balance. I want to make sure I can hear everything in the kit, make sure nothing sticks out. You don't want your toms to stick out. I know a lot of guys, including myself, you get really happy with your tom sound. You love the way the toms sound, but you end up turning it up way too loud. So be careful. Watch out for that. Another relationship within the kit is the kick and snare. It's a very important relationship. The kick and snare are constant. I kind of equate it to the tick-tock sound that a clock makes. It's back and forth just constantly throughout the song. So you want to make sure that they sound good together and that their volumes are pretty equal, because that's a key part of the rhythm of the song. And then you want to also make sure that you can hear your hi-hat or your ride cymbal, whatever the drummer happens to be playing at the time, because that, again, is keeping time. So it's important that that's heard, but isn't too loud and painful either. So after I have my drums up and sounding good, I'll move on to the bass. The bass is an instrument, for me at least, that I'll EQ it some by itself, but then what really matters is how it fits into the mix. So I'll get it up, make sure there's no weird problem frequencies, make sure it's nice and round on the bottom end, that kind of thing. Bass is another thing that you also want to make sure you have a really good gain setting. You want to run your gain a little hot on this. It's going to sound a little better, especially on a digital console. And then I also like to solo my kick drum and the bass guitar and see how they work together. I think that the kick drum should start the note and the bass guitar should finish the note. So you just play with your levels until you get that illusion to work out for you. Now, if you're using loops or any kind of tracks like that, it's probably a good time to go ahead and pull them in after you get your drums and bass up. Get them kind of sitting with the drums if it's a loop, a rhythmic element. Get it to sit well with the drums. You don't want it on top of the drums most of the time. You just kind of want it in the background a little bit. So that's a good time to go ahead and get that. Keyboards for me are usually just a pad element. They just sit in the background and create a good foundation for everything else to sit on. Now, there are exceptions. If you have a song that's piano driven, then yeah, your piano needs to be out front. But if your keyboard player is just playing pads and that kind of thing, just let it sit in the back a little bit. Watch out for too much low end on keyboard patches. Some keyboards have a lot of low end, and the keyboard player may not realize just how much low end it has in his ears or in his monitor. So watch out for that. You might have to take out some low frequencies. You might also watch out for the mid-range frequencies, because this can muddy up your mix pretty bad if a keyboard player has a lot of mid-range frequencies in his tone. So be aware of that. Keyboards, similar to bass, something that you can kind of tweak it by itself, but it really matters what it sounds like. You can kind of tweak it by itself, but what really matters is how it sounds when it's in the mix with everything else. So we'll kind of hold off on that and tweak that later. So acoustic guitars can be pretty tricky in a live environment. Pickups on an acoustic a lot of times just don't sound that great, so it can be a struggle. Most of the time your problem's in the mid-range frequencies, so you can go there and pull some of that out. Most of the time you don't want the acoustic to be too warm in a live sound setting where you're just playing rock music and the guitar player is just jamming away the whole time. That'll just get muddy and nasty in the mix, so the higher frequencies are the more useful frequencies on an acoustic most of the time. If you're doing like an acoustic set or something kind of unplugged feeling, then the low frequencies are great to have. But if you're not, then I would kind of stay away from them. Another trick with acoustic is panning it opposite of your hi-hat. This is because the hi-hat and the acoustic guitar, a lot of times they're doing a very similar rhythm, usually eighth notes, just chunking away the whole song. And so if you pan them opposite of each other, then you'll get some space in your mix. Now, when you're doing this, you can also listen to make sure that the acoustic player is playing in time with the drummer. If he's not, then it can really mess up your mix and make it sound really jumbled and messy. If you have time, you might walk up to the acoustic guitar player and make sure he's happy with his mix and can hear plenty of click and that kind of thing, and maybe even ask him if he can kindly lock in with the drummer a little better, in a nice way, of course. So electric guitars can be a really big part of my mix. They can create a lot of texture, a lot of body, just a lot of character to your sound. So making sure your electric tone is good is very important. Again, if you're having problems with your tone, go check your mic placement, go talk to the player. It's important that you get it right, especially on something as out front as a guitar. So after I have my rhythm guitar sitting where I want it, I'll pull in the lead guitar. And now sometimes, it's the same player, so it may not apply to pull one in and one out. But yeah, you want to make sure your lead guitar can cut through the mix but isn't too painful. And this is something you can kind of judge when you have everything in the mix a little better, kind of EQ it according to your overall mix sound. I'll also pan my guitar players out a little bit opposite of each other if I have two guitar players. If I have one and I have two mics, I'll pan them opposite of each other a little bit, maybe lean it one way or the other, just to try to create some space in the mix. If you're using a digital console, you can even try either double patching the same mic to two channels or just using two different mics and delay one a little bit, maybe 12 to 15 milliseconds, and you'll just get some body out of that, kind of a doubling effect. So that's a cool thing to try if you're having problems with not enough sound from your electric. So after I have everything up and running, after I have all the instruments up and running and feeling okay about the sounds, I'll listen to them all together and listen for things that are interfering with each other, and solo them in groups and see if I can, clean up some of the nastiness. Listen to the song. If the song needs more guitar, then push it. If it needs more keyboards or more drums, whatever, just be aware of what the song needs, what the music needs. So vocals are normally the most important part of the mix. No matter how much you may like drums or bass or keys or guitars because you might play that instrument or whatever, the fact is that the vocals are most of the time the most important thing in the mix. And because of that, you should make sure that you know how to make a vocal sound great, and you should make sure that you spend some time making that vocal sound great. So if you know you're up against a hard deadline for sound check, you should make sure that you get the rest of the band sounding good as quick as possible so that you leave yourself plenty of time to work on the vocal. You might even work on the vocal first. That's another technique for getting the mix to sit right. Now, most of the time I don't do that, but it is an interesting experiment to try, is getting your vocal up first. On the vocal, if you have a really dynamic singer, then you're going to want to set your compression. Be careful and don't over compress it though. One, it'll sound unnatural, but you're also going to bring up a lot of background noise and wash out your whole band mix that you've worked so hard to get. So watch out for that. You want to make sure your vocal is warm and present. At the same time, it's cutting through the mix and that kind of thing. You don't want it to be too harsh and painful. The trick is to get a vocal to be loud and sit on top of the mix without being painful. So, spend some time and get that to happen. If you have tools like a de-esser or maybe even a multi-band compressor, really spend some time getting familiar with these tools and how they work and how to make them work for you. It's just really important that you know how to make your vocals sound great.